Okay, here's a thought. What if a country had, well, just mountains of rice piled up, enough to feed everyone many times over, and then it decided, let's turn a big chunk of that food into fuel. It sounds a bit strange, right? But that's exactly the policy puzzle we're digging into today. India is officially taking over 5 million metric tons of rice, that's like 9% of all the rice traded globally each year, and diverting it to make ethanol. And as we unpack this, I think you'll see just how much this one decision touches. It's energy, sure, but it's also farming, economics, and yeah, even what you might pay for groceries or at the pump. So our mission here is to get into the layers of this, understand the ripples, and really tackle that big food versus fuel question.
It's fascinating because on the surface, the logic seems, well, pretty compelling. India just had a massive paddy harvest, about 146 million tons. The Food Corporation of India, the FCI, is sitting on something like 59 million tons of rice right now.
Wow, 59 million.
Yeah, it's huge. About 4 times the strategic buffer stock they technically need. And at the same time, India imports, over 85% of its crude oil? So you can see the thinking. Use some of this surplus rice, make ethanol, reduce that oil dependency.
Makes sense on paper.
It looks like a brilliant fix, connecting 2 big challenges. But as always, the reality on the ground is a much more complex balancing act.
So, okay, they've got all this rice, but take us back a step. How did India even get serious about ethanol in the first place? What's the big picture energy goal here?
Well, the push for ethanol blending is really, really aggressive. The target is 20% blending in petrol by 2025. That's ambitious.
And how close are they?
They're actually doing pretty well on that front, already hitting around 18.8%.
Yeah.
Now, historically, this whole ethanol thing was mainly about sugarcane. Crush the cane, ferment the molasses left over, distill it. Pretty straightforward, really.
Right, the sweet ethanol story, as you called it earlier.
Yeah.
But I seem to remember hearing about problems with sugarcane lately. What changed?
Exactly. The last couple of years weren't great for sugarcane. You had erratic monsoons, serious droughts, hitting key producing states like Maharashtra and Karnataka.
Ah, okay.
So the sugar mills just couldn't produce enough ethanol to meet their quotas. That forced the government's hand, basically. They had to look for other sources, and quickly.
And that's where all that stockpiled rice comes into the picture.
Precisely. It was the obvious alternative sitting right there. So ethanol distilleries started buying this rice, particularly the stuff FCI labels as surplus or broken rice, often at subsidized prices, mind you.
Okay, so the distilleries get the rice.
They convert it to ethanol, sell that to the big oil marketing companies, and like we said, it looks neat. FCI clears out its overflowing godowns, the distilleries make money, the blending targets get closer, and the oil import bill hopefully shrinks a bit. It seemed like this elegant solution hitting multiple targets at once.
Yeah, you lay it out like that, and it sounds almost, perfect. Clearing storage, hitting targets, cutting imports. But there's always a but, isn't there? What's the catch? What's the other side of this coin?
This is exactly where we bump right into that classic food versus fuel dilemma. Because look, even if it's broken rice or surplus rice, it's still fundamentally food, right? It could be eaten, it could be exported, or it could even go into things like animal feed for poultry or livestock. So making the choice to divert a food crop for fuel, especially in a country that, let's be frank, still struggles with significant undernourishment, that's a trade-off that really demands scrutiny.
And you mentioned undernourishment. Is diverting food grains like this really the best path when you consider India's wider social context?
That's the core question. You look at data, say, from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, IEFA, they point out that more than half of India's population faces issues with malnutrition. The country ranks 105th on the Global Hunger Index.
Wow, 105th.
Yeah. So when you overlay those facts onto this policy, it gets, complicated. And it's not just abstract. When food starts becoming fuel, you see real ripple effects. Prices change, demand shifts. Farmers might start thinking differently about what crops pay best.
And the risk is?
The risk is that poorer households could end up paying more for basic food staples. It's a direct potential consequence.
Has this actually happened before? Is there a precedent for this kind of volatility?
Oh, absolutely. We saw this play out quite clearly back in 2022. Rice prices shot up, and what did the government do? They actually paused the rice for ethanol plan and banned exports of broken rice to try and cool things down domestically.
Right, I remember that ban.
And now, stocks are bulging again, so the diversion is back on. This kind of back and forth, it really highlights a fundamental tension. When your energy policy gets tangled up with your food supply.
Things get unstable.
Exactly. Food security can start playing second fiddle to fuel demands. It forces this really difficult choice, fill tanks or fill bellies, and that often creates instability.
That's a really critical point. Okay, stepping aside from the food dilemma for a moment, let's talk practicalities. How efficient is rice as a source for ethanol compared to sugarcane?
Well, that's another layer. Sugarcane, especially using the molasses, is much more direct. It's already rich in simple sugars, ready for fermentation. Rice, though, it's mostly starch.
So it needs an extra step.
A pretty significant extra step, yeah. You need to first break down those complex starches into simple sugars using enzymes. It's a process called saccharification. Only then can you ferment it. That step adds cost, it uses more energy, and it uses more water.
Okay, so it's more resource intensive than sugarcane. What about the environmental angle? Is rice-based ethanol at least greener?
You'd think so, perhaps, but when you look at the whole life cycle assessment from growing the rice, transport, the energy needed for that extra conversion step, treating the wastewater, all of it adds up.
And the conclusion is?
The conclusion from studies is that the net environmental benefits are pretty much negligible. The high energy and water demands basically cancel out any potential gains. It's not the clean solution it might appear to be at first glance.
And it sounds like this whole system could be creating some, let's say, weird incentives in the farming sector, too.
Oh, definitely. It's basic economics, right? If distilleries, backed by government prices, are paying more for rice than the usual food buyers or feed manufacturers, where do you think farmers are going to sell?
To the distilleries, naturally.
Exactly. And once your food crops start chasing fuel margins, it ripples outwards. It can distort prices in the local mandis, the regulated markets. It can influence decisions about irrigation, which is critical for rice. It can even disrupt the supply and cost of livestock feed. It's a whole chain reaction.
And you mentioned government prices. This isn't really a free market playing out, is it?
Not at all. That's key.
Yeah.
But the input, the FCI rice, is often subsidized. The output, the ethanol, has a price guaranteed by the government. So if the economics don't quite work for the distilleries on their own,
someone else picks up the tab.
Usually the taxpayer, yes. It creates a system that really only works smoothly under a specific set of conditions. You need those bumper harvests keeping supply high, you need global rice prices to be relatively low, and you need domestic food inflation to be stable. It's heavily managed, not market-driven, which makes it inherently fragile.
And with managed systems like this, sometimes loopholes appear. Have there been reports of things like that, distortions or gaming the system?
Yeah, there have been whispers and reports, things like potentially misclassifying better quality grain as broken rice to get the lower FCI price for ethanol production, or sugar mills finding it more profitable to make ethanol directly from juice or syrup rather than producing sugar first, which could then lead to shortages or higher prices in the sugar market itself. Even tracking the exact blending percentages can sometimes be, well, murky. It shows how these policies, even with good intentions, can create unexpected twists.
Okay, so we've got efficiency issues, environmental question marks, the huge food versus fuel ethical dilemma, distorted markets. Given all that, why not just shift away from rice for ethanol? What's keeping it going?
Well, the simple answer really is the incentives. The government offers a pretty attractive price for ethanol, up to around 58 rupees per liter, depending on what it's made from. For many distilleries, converting rice to ethanol is just more profitable than if that rice were sold as, food grain.
So the money's just too good right now.
A very powerful economic incentive for the producers, absolutely.
I know there's talk about diversifying, using maize or sorghum, maybe even damaged food grains that aren't fit for consumption. But rice still seems like the main alternative to sugarcane.
It's the easiest option right now, largely because of that sheer abundance we talked about. But yeah, diversification is definitely on the table. The bigger question, though, is why India isn't moving more aggressively towards second generation, or 2G ethanol.
Right, the stuff made from agricultural waste, like rice straw or husks. That avoids the food conflict entirely.
Exactly. It uses the non-food parts of the plant. The roadblock there, again, it mainly comes down to cost. Setting up a 2G ethanol plant is significantly more expensive, maybe 10 times the cost of a conventional sugar or grain-based distillery.
10 times, wow.
Yeah, the technology is still evolving, it's complex, and frankly, banks are hesitant to finance projects where the returns aren't crystal clear yet. So it raises that tough question. How do you balance the immediate need for fuel and hitting blending targets with investing in these longer-term, more sustainable, but currently expensive solutions.
It's that classic innovation funding challenge. Are other countries managing this transition? What can we learn from elsewhere?
If you look internationally, you see different approaches. Brazil, the ethanol giant, relies heavily on sugarcane, but is also investing a lot in using bagasse, the fibrous waste, and other residues for ethanol.
Okay.
The U.S. started with corn, but is increasingly looking at corn, stover the stalks and leaves cobs, and other agricultural waste. China's explored things like cassava and agri-waste, and they actually discourage using edible grains for fuel.
So there's a common theme there.
The common thread seems to be sustained investment. In the technology, yes, but also in the infrastructure needed to collect and transport all that residue, and importantly, in getting farmers on board and aware of the possibilities.
So can India follow that path? Or is it a different ballgame?
India absolutely can. Maybe it doesn't need a sudden massive leap, though. Perhaps a strategic pivot is the way. Encouraging ethanol from crop stubble, which also helps with the air pollution problem from stubble burning, or using genuinely spoiled grains first.
Building up a parallel system, maybe?
Sort of, yeah. Building that 2G capacity alongside, rather than relying so heavily on a primary food resource. Or maybe even easing back slightly on the blending targets for a while, until the 2G tech is more mature and cost-effective. A more gradual, efficient transition.
And are there signs of movement in that direction? Any positive steps?
Yes, there are some encouraging signs. The government has initiatives like PM Pranam, which aims to nudge states towards using fewer chemical fertilizers and more organic alternatives. That could indirectly influence crop choices relevant to ethanol feedstocks.
Interesting link.
And there is dedicated funding being allocated now for setting up second-generation ethanol plants. If these schemes really take off and scale up, we could definitely start seeing a shift towards more sustainable ethanol production down the line.
Okay, so after walking through all these complexities, let's bring it back. What does all this mean for you listening right now?
Well, if you're an investor, this whole ethanol ecosystem is certainly one to keep an eye on. Think about sugar companies like Sri Renuka Sugars or Balrampur Chini Mills. They're heavily invested in ethanol now.
Big players.
And the companies supporting them, like Praj Industries, providing the tech for these distilleries. Then you've got maize seed companies potentially benefiting if maize becomes a bigger feedstock, agro-logistics firms, maybe even cold storage operators if cropping patterns shift.
And don't forget the auto sector. Car makers are increasingly pushing flex fuel vehicles that can run on higher ethanol blends.
Good point. But the big caveat for investors: this whole sector is very sensitive to government policy changes and, of course, the weather, especially the monsoon rains. Now, for you as a consumer, there's that crucial flip side we discussed. If making ethanol starts heavily influencing what farmers grow and drives up the price of food grains,
Then you'll feel it. Not just maybe a slight difference at the fuel pump because of blending, but potentially a much more noticeable pinch at the grocery store checkout. So wrapping it up, this whole story isn't just about hitting ethanol blending numbers or figuring out what to do with surplus rice. It's fundamentally about navigating trade-offs.
yeah, that seems to be the core theme.
It's that constant balancing act between wanting long-term energy security versus managing short-term food inflation, between designing smart, forward-looking policies versus relying on, well, reactive subsidies. It's a really intricate web.
India is fermenting its rice surplus. The real challenge, it seems, is making sure that in the race for energy independence, the line between using a resource wisely and stretching it too far, potentially at the expense of food security or market stability, doesn't get blurred. What stands out most to you in this complex equation?